Give him another sedative. Right now. The ER doctor's order cut through the trauma bay at Hampton VA Medical Center just as the man on the gurney began to stop breathing. 4 staff members pinned him down. The heart monitor screamed faster. His oxygen level dropped sharply, and his lips turned a grayish purple. He looked to be in his early 50s, wearing an old soaked military jacket. His right hand clenched around a faded dog tag, as if it were the last thing still tying him to this world. Unknown male patient. Suspected homeless veteran. Severely agitated. One paramedic reported quickly. Found near the bus station on Jefferson Avenue. No ID. No family contact. An older nurse drew up the syringe. The clear liquid flashed under the harsh white lights. Everyone in the room saw a dangerous man who needed to be restrained. Only Emily Carter, a nurse who had been working there for just 3 weeks, saw a man dying because he had been misunderstood. She watched his lips turn darker, watched the irregular pulse in his neck, watched his pupils respond too slowly, then looked at his left hand. He was not trying to hit anyone. He was trying to push the IV line away from his body. When the medication cart rolled closer, his body convulsed harder. Not because he wanted to attack, but as if he recognized the very thing they were about to put into him. Hold him down. The doctor snapped. Inject it now. The needle was only a few inches from the IV port when Emily stepped forward and blocked the other nurse's hand. Stop. The entire room turned toward her. The ER doctor looked at her as if she had just broken an order that had stood for years inside that room. Carter. What are you doing, Emily? Did not take her eyes off the patient. He isn't having a psychiatric episode. He's in respiratory distress. If you give him that dose, he could die. A heavy silence fell over the room. At the far end, the door opened. Dr. Marcus Vale, the hospital's medical director, stepped in wearing a perfectly pressed white coat and a calm expression that felt almost cold. What's going on? He asked. The ER doctor answered immediately. Unknown male patient. Possible. Homeless. Veteran. Highly agitated. Nurse Carter is blocking sedation. Dr. Vale looked at Emily. Ms. Carter. Step aside. Emily kept the syringe away from the IV line. No. I need to recheck the medication. His blood type. His glucose level. And the cause of his respiratory distress before anyone injects another respiratory depressant into him. You've only been here 3 weeks, the ER doctor said through clenched teeth. And he may not survive another 3 minutes if we keep going in the wrong direction. Emily replied. The man on the gurney suddenly clenched his right hand harder. The dog tag slipped from his palm and tapped softly against the metal rail. Emily looked down. Beneath dried blood and faded scratches, she could make out the faint engraving, Rhodes. Caleb M. Opus usen trident 4-7. She froze. The blood type on the dog tag was O positive. But the hospital wristband they had just printed for him said AB negative. That was no longer a small mistake. In an emergency room, the wrong blood type could kill a person. And when Emily saw Dr. Vale's eyes pause on the code Trident 4-7 for the briefest second, she understood that he recognized the name. Inject the medication, Dr. Vale said, his voice dropping lower. Emily turned to him. I said no. The air inside the trauma bay turned solid. Dr. Vale stepped closer, his eyes cold and flat as glass. You do not have the authority to give orders in this room, but I do have a responsibility to keep a patient from dying because of the wrong injection. The monitor warned that his oxygen was dropping again. Caleb gasped beneath the lack of air, his chest rising weakly. Emily had no more time to argue. She turned to the emergency team, her voice firm. Ambubag. Max oxygen. Get naloxone ready. Check his glucose now. And keep that sedative away from his IV. No one moved for the first second. Emily looked straight at the nurse holding the syringe. If he dies from that injection, the signature on the chart will not save any of us. That sentence made the nurse's hand stop. A young staff member immediately handed over an oxygen mask. Emily lifted Caleb's chin, opened his airway, sealed the mask over his face, and watched every weak movement of his chest. Someone else grabbed the glucose meter. A warning beep sounded moments later. His blood sugar is low, dextrose. Now, Emily said, and nobody touches the sedative. For the next 5 minutes, the emergency room was filled only with the sound of the monitor, the squeeze of the resuscitation bag, and the muffled rain beating against the windows. Cold sweat ran down Emily's temple, but her hands did not shake. She had seen this kind of breathing before in her father, a former Navy corpsman who had once been misdiagnosed after returning from Iraq. That was why she knew a soldier's panic was not the same as madness. And a body starved of oxygen could not be silenced with more sedation. By the 5th minute, the rhythm on the monitor changed. His oxygen level began to climb. The purple color on Caleb's lips slowly faded. The room went silent. Not because everything was fine, but because the man they had nearly sedated again had started breathing on his own. Caleb opened his eyes and looked at Emily through the fogged oxygen mask. There was more than gratitude in his stare. There was also the fear of a man who knew he had just survived his first brush with death, but had not yet escaped the people who wanted him silent. Emily leaned closer. Caleb tried to lift his hand, each tiny movement seeming to take the last of his strength. His index finger touched the back of the faded dog tag, then tapped 3 very faint beats against the metal rail of the gurney. Tap, tap, tap. Emily went still. She knew it was not the tremor of a man in drug shock, and it was not the aftershock of a seizure. Those 3 short taps had intention. They had spacing. They carried the desperate awareness of a man trying to send one last signal before the darkness pulled him under again. "Doctor," Vale spoke behind her. "Move him to isolation. And Ms. Carter, after this shift, come to my office." Emily did not answer. She looked at the dog tag in Caleb's hand, at the code trident, 47, at the hospital wristband showing the wrong blood type, then at the medication record open on the computer screen, where one edited entry appeared at 217A. For the first time that night, Emily understood that she had not only saved a dying patient, she had stopped someone from finishing something that had been planned in advance. Out in the hallway, as the gurney was pushed toward isolation, Dr. Vale slipped his phone from beneath his white coat and sent one very short text message. He survived. The nurse interfered. What do you think Emily noticed that everyone else in the ER missed? Leave your prediction in the comments. And tell us what city you're watching from. The text had barely been sent when Caleb Rhodes's gurney disappeared behind the door of room 412. Emily stood in the middle of the ER hallway, the smell of latex still clinging to her hands, the sound of the monitor still echoing from the room that had just closed. The man was breathing again, but the pressure in her chest had not eased. Something had been wrong from the start. Not the kind of mistake made in the rush of an overloaded night shift, but something deliberate. Something prepared. Something hidden behind procedure. Signatures and cold. Practiced words. She walked back to the computer station near the nurse's desk and opened the patient file. Minutes earlier, she had entered the name from the dog tag Caleb M. Rhodes. Now, the name was gone. On the screen, only one line remained: John Doe Behavioral Risk, Level 4. Below it, a new diagnosis had just been added: acute psychotic agitation with violent tendency. There was no clear note saying he had nearly gone into respiratory failure. No warning about the blood type mismatch. No mention that the sedative dose they had just stopped could have killed him. Emily looked at the timestamp on the chart edit. 2:17 a.m. The exact moment Caleb's oxygen had started to crash. She pulled the chair closer and read every line under the pale blue glow of the monitor. Farther down the hallway, 2 security guards were now posted outside room 412. One of them pulled the curtain over the small window in the door, cutting off the only view from the hallway to the hospital bed inside. Caleb had just been saved, but now he was being guarded like a prisoner. "Don't touch that chart again." Emily turned around. Linda Perez, the night shift charge nurse, was standing behind her, her face tight with anxiety. Linda had worked at Hampton VA for nearly 20 years. She was not cruel, but the tired look in her eyes told Emily she had seen too much to still believe the truth could protect anyone by itself. His name was just changed back. Emily said, "I entered Caleb Rhodes from the dog tag, and the system switched him back to John Doe." Linda looked at the screen, then quickly glanced down the hallway. "You should close it. You don't think this is strange? The dog tag says O positive, but the hospital wristband says AB negative. The medication record was edited right when he went into respiratory distress. The isolation order was entered before a psychiatric evaluation was even completed." Linda said nothing, and that silence told Emily she was not surprised. "Emily," Linda said quietly, "you're new here. You still think this place runs like a hospital?" "It is hospital." On the sign outside, yes. At veteran memorial ceremonies, yes. When there are media cameras around, yes. Linda looked toward the main lobby, where the American flag and framed photographs of service members hung proudly on the wall. But during shifts like this place is a machine. Patients who stay quiet, who are easy to treat, easy to chart, easy to process, get called heroes. Patients who take up time, file complaints, remember too much, or ask too many questions become risks, and risks have to be managed. The word managed fell between them. Clean and cruel at the same time. Emily looked back at the screen. A new alert appeared. Transfer recommended pending psychiatric stabilization. External secure facility. She opened the order. The approving physician was Dr. Marcus Vale. Order created 2:04 a.m. Emily froze. Caleb had been brought into the emergency room at 2:11. The transfer order had been created before he ever came through the hospital doors. "That's impossible," she whispered. Linda closed her eyes for the briefest second. "Stop asking questions. This order was created before he was admitted." "You think I didn't see that? Then why isn't anyone doing anything?" Linda looked at her, and there was no indifference in her eyes. Only fear that had been living inside a tired body for far too long. Because the people who used to do something don't work here anymore. Emily heard the monitor from room 412 beeping steadily in the distance. Weak but alive. She remembered Caleb's hand touching the dog tag. Remembered the 3 soft taps against the gurney rail. It had not been a tremor. It had been a signal. A man the entire room had called delusional had used the last of his strength to ask for help. The sound of dress shoes echoed down the hallway. Dr. Vale appeared at the entrance to the nurse's station. His white coat was still perfectly pressed, as if the chaos in the trauma bay minutes earlier had never touched him. His eyes landed on the computer screen in front of Emily, then moved to her hand, resting on the mouse. "Ms. Carter," he said. "I thought you had been instructed to return to triage." Emily did not stand. "I'm reviewing the patient's chart. That patient is no longer your responsibility. He is still in the emergency department, and you have interfered enough." Linda lowered her head and stepped aside. Emily could feel exactly where she stood in that room, a new nurse still within her probationary period, with no allies, no authority, facing a man who could end her career with a single internal report. But she had also seen what Dr. Vale did not want anyone to see. The transfer order created at 204A. You created the transfer order before Caleb Rhodes was admitted. Emily said, Doctor. Vale's expression did not change. But the air around him seemed to grow colder. You are reading things you are not authorized to understand. Then explain it to me. Certain orders are prepared in advance for emergency situations. That is protocol. Prepared in advance for a patient who had not arrived yet, whose identity had not been verified, who had not received a psychiatric evaluation, and who had not even been examined. Linda tightened her grip on the folder in her hands. Doctor. Vale stepped closer. The smell of his expensive cologne, mixed with antiseptic and stale coffee at the nurse's station. Ms. Carter. Do you know why veteran hospitals are difficult to run? He asked. Because every day, we deal with people who have been broken by war in ways outsiders do not understand. Some cling to delusions about old missions, old ranks, old enemies. If every new nurse saw a conspiracy in every case, this place would collapse. Emily looked at him. The speech was too smooth, too reasonable, too much like something that had been repeated many times before, designed to turn other people's suspicion into ignorance. He had a dog tag. She said, Objects do not verify identity. The blood type on the dog tag does not match the hospital wristband. A homeless man can pick up anything. He reacted to the medication. You are not a doctor, but I am the person who kept him alive. That sentence darkened Dr. Vale's eyes. Only for a moment, but long enough for Emily to understand. What angered him was not that she had overstepped, it was that Caleb was still breathing. Dr. Vale reached down, folded the transfer order on the desk, and placed it inside Linda's file. From now until the end of your shift, you are not to enter room 412. You are not to access this chart. You are not to speak to this patient. If you continue, I will file a formal violation for breaching confidentiality and interfering with treatment. Emily asked quietly. Are you banning me from caring for a patient because I found errors in his record? I am protecting this hospital from an employee who does not understand her limits. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. Compassion is a fine quality. Ms. Carter. But here, compassion does not get to replace discipline. When Dr. Vale walked away, Linda exhaled as if she had been holding her breath for too long. She looked at Emily with something close to pleading. Don't keep going. You don't know who you're dealing with. Emily looked toward room 412. The curtain had been drawn shut. Caleb Rhodes was lying behind that door. Renamed, locked out of his own chart, and scheduled to be transferred out of the hospital before he had even been saved. On the wall behind the nurse's station, the slogan, "Serving those who served," still glowed beneath the white lights. But for the first time, Emily saw it as a promise that had been betrayed. She turned back to the screen. Her access to Caleb's chart disappeared. A message appeared, access denied. Administrative restriction. Emily sat still for a few seconds. Then she opened her shift notebook. She did not access the chart again. She simply wrote down what she remembered, the wrong blood type. The code Trident 47. The transfer order at 204. The medication edit at 217. And Caleb's 3 taps on the gurney rail. Linda looked at her. What are you doing, Emily? Did not look up, writing it down before they erased the rest. If you have ever seen someone powerless treated unfairly, simply because they had no voice, hit. Like to stand with people like Emily who are brave enough to speak up. That night, Emily did not return to low acuity triage the way Dr. Vale had ordered. She folded the note, slipped it into the pocket of her white coat, and walked toward the medication storage room, where every edit left a trace. Even when the person who made it believed no one small enough and stubborn enough would ever follow it to the end. The medication storage room sat at the end of the hallway behind the emergency department, where the lights were always too bright and a security camera hung above the doorframe like an eye that never blinked. Emily slowed down a few steps before she reached it. Not because she was afraid of being seen, but because she knew that from this moment on, everything she did could be turned into evidence against her. She did not open the door right away. She stood beside the old vending machine, pretending to adjust the pocket of her white coat while glancing through the small window in the storage room door. No one was inside. Steel shelves held neatly arranged boxes of medication, cold and harmless beneath the white lights. But Emily knew that inside a hospital, the thing that killed people was not always a knife or a gun. Sometimes it was a changed drug label, a sedative order signed too quickly, a line of notes deleted from a chart before sunrise. She placed her employee badge against the scanner. A beep sounded. The door unlocked. The smell of disinfectant, plastic packaging, and refrigerated air poured out. Emily stepped inside and let the door close behind her. She did not touch a single box of medication. First, she looked at the camera in the corner of the room, then at the inventory sheet hanging beside the controlled substance cabinet. Her father had once told her something she never forgot. When you walk into a place that can hide the truth, don't look for the most obvious thing. Look for the thing that is just slightly out of place. Her father, Thomas Carter, had been a Navy corpsman. After Iraq, he came home to Kentucky with no feeling in one shoulder, nightmares that arrived without warning, and a habit of sitting with his back against the wall in every diner. Outsiders called it paranoia. When Emily was little, she thought her father was simply afraid of the dark. It was not until she grew up that she understood he was not afraid of the dark. He was afraid of the things that had once come out of it, and the most painful part was not that war had changed him. It was that the first civilian hospital he went to had looked at him as a problem to be controlled instead of a person who needed to be understood. The night her father struggled to breathe, a doctor had almost sedated him because he thought Thomas was losing control. Emily, only 17 at the time, had screamed that her father's blood sugar was crashing and that he was reacting to the medication. She had not known enough to save him from the years that followed, but she had known enough to understand one thing. The body of a wounded soldier often tells the truth before his mouth can. She pulled the inventory sheet closer. The medication prepared for Caleb appeared in the final column, haloperidol, benzodiazepine, and an unusually abbreviated medication code beside the note agitation protocol. Emily frowned. The dosage was not only high for someone in respiratory distress, it had also been placed under the category used for violent, non-compliant patients. Even though Caleb had not been in the ER long enough for a full assessment, she took out her personal phone, then stopped before taking a picture. If the system wanted to blame her, a photo taken outside protocol could become the knife they handed straight to Dr. Vale. Emily put the phone away, opened the small notebook in her coat pocket, and quickly wrote down every detail medication code. Release time. Approving user. Cabinet number. Her handwriting was neat, small, and steady. A very soft sound came from the hallway. Emily lifted her head. Not footsteps, not a rolling cart. It was the faint sound of metal touching the doorframe. Then silence. She switched off the small desk light beside the inventory sheet and stepped behind a medication shelf. Through the gap between the plastic bins, she saw a shadow pass across the small window. The person did not enter. They only stopped long enough to look inside. Emily held her breath. The shadow disappeared. She waited 5 more seconds, then stepped out. Her heart was pounding, but her mind had become even clearer. If there was nothing to hide, no one would be checking the medication room at this hour. She returned to the inventory sheet and looked more closely at the medication release entered at 217A. M. The approving user was not the ER doctor, and it was not the assigned nurse. The approval account read M. Vale, Admin. Emily felt her hand go cold. Doctor. Vale did not just know what had happened. He had personally touched the medication record at the exact moment Caleb went into respiratory distress. She had just written down the access code when the pager on her hip vibrated. An internal message appeared, room 412. Patient unstable. Staff only. Emily did not think twice. She closed the notebook, pushed it deep into her coat pocket, left the medication room, and hurried toward room 412. The hallway felt longer than before. White light spilled across the floor in cold strips. The two security guards were still standing outside the door. But this time, they did not look at her like a troublesome new nurse. They looked at her like someone they had been told to keep away. I need to check the patient, Emily said. One guard stepped in front of the door. Doctor, Vale said you're not allowed in. I just received an alert that the patient is unstable. There's already a doctor inside. Emily looked through the small window in the door. The curtain inside had not been pulled completely shut. Through the narrow gap, she saw Caleb lying on his side in the bed, both wrists secured with soft restraints to the bed rails. A psychiatrist stood beside him, and Dr. Vale was near the head of the bed. But what made Emily stop breathing was not the people in the room. It was Caleb's eyes. He was staring straight at the ceiling camera. Not wildly, not blankly. He was counting the corners of the room. Then, very slowly, Caleb rotated his restrained wrist. His index finger tapped against the edge of the bed. This time it was not 3 short taps like before. Emily watched closely, pressing her lips together as she counted. 1 short tap, 1 long tap, 1 short tap, then a pause. She had learned Morse code from her father during power outages in Kentucky, when he tried to turn the obsessions of war into a game so his daughter would not be afraid. Back then, Emily thought she was only learning an old code. She never imagined that years later, those tiny taps would become the only voice of a man the entire hospital had called delusional. Caleb tapped again. Slowly, weakly, but deliberately, Emily pieced the signals together in her mind. N, O, V, A, I, L. No Vale. Don't trust Vale. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Inside the room, Doctor Vale bent closer to Caleb and said something she could not hear through the glass. Caleb closed his eyes, but his finger still moved faintly beneath the restraint. Emily turned to the guard. I need to get in there now. No. He's trying to communicate. The guard frowned. He's hallucinating. No. He's using Morse code. The guard let out a humorless laugh. Do you hear yourself? Emily did not answer. She looked back at Caleb. In that moment, she was no longer standing in a hospital hallway. She saw her father in their small kitchen in Kentucky, his hands shaking from medication, his eyes red from lack of sleep, tapping rhythms on the tabletop to teach her the difference between a distress signal and meaningless noise. She heard his voice. People will call a wounded soldier difficult, aggressive, paranoid, but you have to watch their hands, their eyes, the way they choose an exit. The body always remembers the battlefield, even when the hospital wants to forget. Emily took a deep breath. She stepped back half a pace and stopped arguing with the guard. Arguing at the door would only get her dragged away. She needed another way in. At the end of the hallway, there was a side door used by housekeeping staff. It connected to a supply room, then led to the back entrance of room 412. Emily knew that because, during her first week, when no one trusted her with anything important, they had assigned her to check every ER bay and learn the equipment routes. The people who had underestimated her had accidentally given her a map of the place. She turned away. Where are you going? The guard asked. To stay within my limits, Emily said. But the moment she was out of their line of sight, she turned straight into the side door. The handle was ice cold beneath her palm. Inside, The supply room was darker than the hallway, filled with the smell of cleaning cloths, bleach, and damp plastic. Emily moved past shelves stacked with folded linens and found the small door at the back. Her heart was racing, but each step felt clearer than the last. She was no longer just suspicious of a mistake. She had seen the medication trail. She had seen the chart changed. She had read Caleb's warning in a language Dr. Vale had never expected a new nurse to understand. The rear door to room 412 was slightly ajar. Emily looked through the crack. Dr. Vale stood with his back to her, holding a small syringe. The psychiatrist beside him spoke quietly. "Are you sure you want to use this dose now? The FBI hasn't." Dr. Vale cut him off. His voice so low, it was almost just a breath. "No one calls the FBI. No one re-enters his name. And no one lets a delusional patient destroy this hospital." Emily stood frozen behind the door. FB. That was the first word that confirmed her fear reached beyond the walls of this hospital. On the bed, Caleb opened his eyes. He saw Emily through the crack in the door. For one brief second. His exhausted face did not show pleading. It showed an order. Using the last of his strength, he turned his restrained hand and tapped 3 very soft beats against the bed rail. Not to ask for help this time. This time, he was telling her to run. But Emily did not run. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. Emily pushed the door open just as Dr. Vale lifted the syringe from the metal tray. The entire room froze for one breath. The psychiatrist spun around, his face going pale as if he had been caught in the middle of a sentence he had never meant to finish. Dr. Vale did not flinch. He only lowered his eyes slowly to the name badge on Emily's chest, as if her appearance was not a threat, but a small procedural error that needed to be corrected. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "You have just violated a direct order." Emily stood at the rear entrance of the room, her hand still on the ice-cold handle. She looked at the syringe in his hand, at Caleb restrained on the bed, at the oxygen tubing running across the hollowed cheek of the man she had just pulled back from the edge of death. "I received an alert that the patient was unstable. That alert was for the attending physician." "Then why wasn't the back door locked?" Emily asked. A very brief silence fell over the room. Dr. Vale placed the syringe back on the tray, but Emily saw his fingers remain close to the edge of it, as if the moment she stepped back, he would continue what he had been doing. Caleb lay still on the bed. Both of his wrists were held by soft restraints, but his eyes were awake. Not fully well, not fully safe, but awake in a way that was painful to witness. He looked at Emily not as if she were the person who had saved his life, but as if she were the only person in that hospital who still believed he was human. "Remove the restraints," Emily said. The psychiatrist frowned. "The patient is a violence risk. He is too weak to sit up by himself. You do not have the authority to assess. He is communicating in Morse code." Emily cut in. He tapped out "No Veil" from outside the room. And before that, he tapped SOS on the gurney. That was not a hallucination. Dr. Vale let out a soft laugh. It was not loud or crude, but it was filled with contempt. A delusional patient taps his fingers on a bed, and you turn it into military code. "Do you hear yourself?" Emily did not answer him. She walked to Caleb's bedside, moving slowly so he could see every motion she made. She did not touch the restraints right away. She lowered her voice, the way her father had once taught her to speak when approaching a soldier who had just come out of a nightmare. "Chief Rhodes," she said, "I'm Emily Carter. I won't touch you unless you agree. Can you still hear me?" Caleb's lips moved faintly beneath the oxygen tube. The sound that escaped was weak, almost nothing more than breath. "Don't let him." "I know," Emily said. "I heard you." For the first time since she had entered the room, Caleb's expression changed. Not much, just the tension around his eyes loosening. a small part of his body dropping out of total defense. In a room filled with degrees, titles, and power. The words "I heard you" were the only thing that made him tremble less. Emily turned to the psychiatrist. He has the right to be evaluated while he is conscious, not after he is given more medication. If you document him as incapacitated right now while he is responding with intent, you will have to explain that to a review board. The psychiatrist looked at Dr. Vale. That one look told Emily the real power in the room did not come from medical expertise. It came from fear of the man in charge. Dr. Vale stepped closer to the bed, his voice dropping lower. "You are destroying your career for a man you know nothing about." Emily looked at Caleb. "I know the blood type on his wristband is wrong. I know the transfer order was created before he was admitted. I know medication was released under your admin account at 217 a.m. And I know you mentioned the FBI before I walked in." That was when Dr. Vale's composure finally cracked. Only slightly, but enough. The psychiatrist immediately looked over at him. Caleb closed his eyes, but Emily saw a small tear slip from the corner of his eye. She did not know if it came from pain, exhaustion, or the fact that after being called delusional too many times, someone had finally said out loud what he could not. "Doctor." Vale moved closer to Emily. "Get out." "No. You will be suspended before this night is over. Then suspend me after I document the patient's condition." He stared at her for a long moment, then turned to the psychiatrist. "We will continue once security is present." He picked up the medication tray and left through the main door. The psychiatrist hesitated for 1 second, then followed him out. The door closed, leaving only Emily, Caleb, the monitor, and a silence that felt as heavy as a confession. Emily did not rush to remove the restraints. She checked Caleb's breathing, pulse, and pupils first, then leaned closer. "I need to know if you want me to loosen the restraints." Blink once for yes, twice for no. Caleb blinked once. Emily loosened the restraint on his right hand first, slowly, making sure he did not feel startled. When his wrist was freed, she saw thin old scars beneath the bruised skin, layered over one another in a way that did not resemble ordinary battlefield wounds. They looked like marks left by restraints, by needles, by a long period of being controlled under something called treatment. Caleb lifted his hand to his neck and touched the dog tag. His fingers trembled so badly that Emily lightly supported his wrist, but she did not pull or take it from him. She let him decide. After a few seconds, Caleb removed the chain from around his neck and placed the dog tag in her palm. "Don't give it to Vale," he whispered. "I won't give it to him. Not just this hospital." Emily stayed silent, giving him time to breathe. Caleb tried to swallow. Every word seemed to scrape through a throat full of broken stone. Dead men's names. They're still receiving treatment. The bills still run. The funds still disappear. Emily looked at the dog tag in her hand. The metal was cold. The scratched edge felt sharp. Dried blood clung to the engraved grooves. "What is Trident 47? Caleb closed his eyes, but his hand tightened faintly around her wrist. It was not the grip of a frightened patient clinging to someone. It was the reflex of a soldier holding on to the last messenger. "Last mission," he said. "I found my teammate's name in treatment records. He died in Kandahar 12 years ago. But on paper, he was still in rehab in Virginia. Month after month, year after year, Emily felt her throat tighten. She had heard of insurance fraud. She had heard of system errors, missing funds, and money vanishing through layers of administration. But hearing a Navy SEAL, barely alive, say that dead men were still being turned into revenue made the white light in the room suddenly feel filthy. "Who did it?" she asked. Caleb looked toward the door. Vale is only a door A door to where? He did not answer right away. His eyes moved down to the dog tag in her hand. Backside. Trident. Emily turned the dog tag over. Attached close to the chain was a small trident pin. So old, the metal had nearly blackened. She pressed her fingernail gently against the edge of the pin. It did not open. Caleb shook his head faintly. Not here, he said. Camera. Emily looked up at the ceiling camera. The small red light in the corner was still glowing. She understood. Caleb was not just afraid of Dr. Vale. He was afraid of the room itself. Emily closed her hand around the dog tag and slipped it into the inside pocket of her white coat, where the camera could not see it. I'll keep it safe. Caleb let out a shaky breath, but it sounded lighter than before. For a few seconds, the room no longer felt like a place of confinement. It became a fragile shelter between two strangers, a new nurse, everyone underestimated, and a soldier whose name had been erased. Neither of them had enough power to defeat the system waiting outside. But in that moment, they had something the system could not fake with paperwork. Trust. Your father, Caleb whispered. Emily froze. How did you know? You're Morse. He tried to smile, but the smile appeared only as a tired crack across his pale face. People who learn from books count differently. People who learn from soldiers, they hear the silence. Emily could not speak for a moment. The image of her father returned with painful clarity, his calloused fingers tapping rhythms on the kitchen table. His voice rough after sleepless nights. His eyes softening every time she tapped the right signal back. She had thought those memories were only a sad part of her childhood. Tonight, they had become the reason a man survived. He was a Navy corpsman, Emily said quietly. People called him paranoid, too. Caleb looked at her longer. The caution in his eyes did not disappear completely, but part of the wall had come down. Then you understand. I don't understand all of it, Emily replied, but I won't call your pain a delusion just because it makes other people uncomfortable. At that moment, the overhead speaker crackled in the hallway. Security to room 412. Repeat. Security to room 412. Emily turned toward the door. Footsteps were coming closer. Caleb tried to hold her hand, but his strength was fading quickly. Agent Miller, he whispered. V-b-b. Don't call through the hospital. They hear everything. How do I find him? Caleb looked down at the pocket of her white coat, where the dog tag had just been hidden. In there, the footsteps stopped outside the door. A security guard's voice called out. Ms. Carter. Open the door. Emily looked at Caleb. He was so exhausted, his eyes were almost closed. But the hand she had freed still rested on the edge of the bed. He was no longer tapping a signal. He had given the rest to her. Emily pulled the blanket over his bruised wrist, adjusted his oxygen mask, and stood upright as the door handle began to turn. She knew that from this moment on, she was no longer a nurse who had accidentally saved the wrong important patient. She had become the keeper of the secret doctor. Vale wanted buried before sunrise. The story has only just begun. Subscribe now so you don't miss the moment the truth finally comes to light in the next parts. The handle of room 412 turned downward, and Emily managed to step in front of Caleb's bed just as two security guards entered. The first was the same guard who had blocked her in the hallway. He looked at Emily, then at the loosened restraint on Caleb's right wrist. His expression hardened immediately. You were ordered to leave this room. Emily kept her voice calm. The patient just showed signs of awareness and intentional communication. I'm documenting his condition. That is no longer necessary. A voice said behind them. Doctor. Vale entered with Linda Perez and the on-call psychiatrist. This time, he was not carrying the medication tray. In his hand was a thin folder held together with a yellow paperclip. The kind of administrative file Emily knew at a glance had not been created to heal anyone. It had been created to remove someone. Caleb Rhodes will be transferred to an out-of-state high-security psychiatric facility within 30 minutes. Doctor, Vale said. The decision has been approved. The room became so quiet that every beep of Caleb's monitor sounded painfully clear. Emily looked at the folder. Then at Caleb. He lay motionless beneath the oxygen mask. But his eyes were slightly open. He had heard. He is not stable enough for transfer. Emily said, he went into respiratory distress less than an hour ago. There is no complete toxicology report. No neurological evaluation. No verified military identity. And no independent consult. Doctor. Vale opened the folder and turned a page as if she were merely delaying paperwork. The patient is a violence risk with military-related delusions. Non-compliance with treatment. And a documented threat to staff safety. Transfer is necessary. Emily took one step forward. He is restrained in a hospital bed and breathing through an oxygen mask. You call that a threat? The psychiatrist avoided her eyes. Linda stood near the door, pale-faced, both hands gripping a secondary folder. Emily could see the conflict in her expression, but she could also see the fear keeping her still. A system like this did not need everyone inside it to be cruel. It only needed the people who knew the truth to stay silent at the right moment. Doctor. Vale handed the papers to Linda. Prepare the transfer documentation. Security will assist with patient restraint during transport. Emily looked down at the first page. Even with a quick glance, she saw the order, creation, time, 204 A.M., the same order that had been created before Caleb was admitted. Now it had been dressed up with the word emergency, as if paperwork could turn a cover-up into a medical decision. No, Emily said. Linda closed her eyes faintly. The psychiatrist froze. One guard frowned. Doctor. Vale looked at Emily as if she had finally placed her own neck beneath the blade. What did you just say? He asked. Emily pulled the small notebook from the pocket of her white coat. While keeping Caleb's dog tag hidden deep inside the fabric, I said, no. This transfer order was created before the patient was admitted. His chart was renamed after I verified his dog tag. The blood type on his hospital wristband is wrong. Medication was released under your admin account at 217 A.M. And now you want to remove him from this hospital before anyone outside can examine him. Doctor, Vale closed the folder. Ms. Carter, you are accusing the hospital's medical director based on personal notes and an overactive imagination. No. I am asking you to stop a transfer order that could kill this patient. This patient is not under your care. He is under the right to stay alive. The room went still after that sentence. For one brief moment, Emily heard Caleb's breathing grow heavier beneath the mask. She did not turn around, but she knew he was fighting to stay awake. Maybe he had listened to too many people speak for him. Sign for him. Erase his name for him. And now, for the first time that night, someone was using her own voice to keep him there. Doctor. Vale turned to the guards. Remove her. The two guards moved forward. Emily did not step back. She stood beside the bed, one hand on the rail, the other holding up her notebook high enough for everyone to see. I am requesting that the hallway cameras record my objection to transferring an unstable patient. I am requesting that the chart reflect the patient communicated intentionally through Morse code, confirmed his name as Caleb Rhodes, and requested that his personal evidence not be given to Dr. Vale. Doctor. Vale's eyes sharpened at the word evidence. What evidence? Emily did not blink. You just used that word in your head. Didn't you? No one in the room said anything. But Linda looked at Emily. And for the first time, there was more than fear in her eyes. There was something small, like a conscience waking up after years of silence. Doctor. Vale stepped closer to Emily. His voice dropped. No longer meant for the room. Only for her. You think you are doing something noble. But you do not understand that man. He was destroyed by war. Men like him cling to stories so they can survive. You are feeding his delusions. Emily looked straight at him. No, I am seeing what you are afraid everyone else will see. A flash of anger crossed Dr. Vale's face. He turned to the psychiatrist. Document this. Nurse Carter is emotionally unstable, interfering with treatment, agitating the patient, and creating a safety risk. The psychiatrist lifted his pen. But he did not write immediately. Emily looked at him. If you write that, write this too. Write that I requested an independent toxicology screening and military identity verification before transfer. Write that the patient had just been saved from respiratory failure after I stopped a respiratory depressant from being injected into him. Write the whole thing, doctor, not just the part that helps you sleep tonight. The psychiatrist's hand stopped. Doctor, Vale lost patience. Enough. You are suspended immediately. Give your employee badge to Linda. Leave the emergency department. If you step into this room again, I will call hospital police and report you to the Virginia Board of Nursing. Emily heard every word like doors slamming shut in front of her. Her job, her license, her reputation. Everything she had built through years of study and exhausting shifts was suddenly placed on the table as the price of refusing to look away. For 1 second, real fear touched her. Not fear of Dr. Vale, but the ordinary kind of fear that ruins lives, losing her job, losing her home, losing her future, becoming another name crossed out of the system like Caleb. Then Caleb moved, very slowly. His loosened right hand slid out from beneath the blanket. His trembling fingers touched the bed rail. He did not tap out a code this time. He simply rested them there. As if searching for something solid, Emily looked at that hand, at the bruises around his wrist, at the dog tag hidden in her coat pocket like a cold piece of metal pressed against her heart. She removed the employee badge from her chest, but she did not hand it to Linda. She placed it on the bedside table, directly beneath the room camera. If you want to suspend me, do it, Emily said. If you want to report me, report me. But I will not leave this room so you can transfer a man too weak to remove his own restraints. Under an order created before he was ever admitted, Dr. Vale looked at the badge on the table. You are ending your own career. Emily placed her hand on the bed rail. If you want to take him, you will have to get through me first. And I want that recorded. The air in the room turned thick. One guard looked to Dr. Vale, waiting for the order. Linda gripped the folder so hard the edges of the papers bent. The psychiatrist stepped back, half a pace. As if he had suddenly realized this was no longer an internal disagreement. It was a line. On one side stood power with enough paperwork to call cruelty procedure. On the other stood a new nurse, no longer wearing a badge on her chest, standing in front of the hospital bed of a soldier whose identity had been erased. Dr. Vale slowly took out his phone. Call transport. And call hospital police. Then Linda spoke. So quietly, it almost disappeared. Marcus, he isn't stable. Dr. Vale snapped his head toward her. One look was enough to silence her instantly. But what had happened could not be taken back. Someone inside the system had just wavered out loud, even if only for one sentence. Emily saw it. Dr. Vale saw it too. Just then, Caleb tried to pull down his oxygen mask. Emily quickly supported his hand. Don't talk. You need to breathe. But Caleb kept trying. His lips were cracked and dry, his voice nearly dissolving into the sound of the monitor. Miller. Emily leaned closer. Agent Miller. Caleb blinked once. Then he whispered again, each broken word falling like drops of blood on the floor. Don't let them transfer me. Emily held his hand gently. I won't let them transfer you. Out in the hallway, the wheels of a transport gurney rolled closer to room 412. A security radio crackled. Footsteps gathered, growing heavier and faster. Doctor. Vale straightened. His calm expression, returning to his face like a mask, put back on at exactly the right time. Ms. Carter, he said, this is your last chance to step aside. Emily looked at him, then at the ceiling camera, then at Caleb. She knew she could be pulled out of the room within seconds, but she also knew something else. If Caleb was taken away tonight, the dog tag in her pocket might be the only thing left to prove he had ever been here under his real name. She stood in front of the bed, shoulders straight, both hands on the cold rail. No. The door to room 412 opened wide. The transport team stepped in with 2 hospital police officers. And just as one of them moved toward Emily, the desk phone at the nurse's station outside the room began ringing violently. The sound cut through the entire hallway, sharp and relentless, slicing across every order in the room. A young nurse rushed over and answered it. A second later, her face went pale. She looked into room 412, her voice breaking. Dr. Vale, there's an emergency call from the federal switchboard. They're requesting an immediate lock on Caleb Rhodes's records. Doctor. Vale stood completely still. The young nurse swallowed hard. The FBI is on its way. That sentence left room 412 completely silent. No one moved. The transport team froze in the doorway beside the empty gurney. The 2 hospital police officers glanced at each other, their hands hovering near their radios. Linda Perez went pale, and the on-call psychiatrist lowered his eyes to the file in his hands, as if not looking at anyone meant he would not have to choose a side. Only Dr. Marcus Vale remained standing perfectly straight, but Emily saw his jaw tighten. What did you say, Doctor? Vale asked the young nurse in the hallway. The nurse held the desk phone with both hands, her voice trembling as she repeated herself. The federal switchboard is requesting an immediate lock on Caleb Rhodes's records. They said no one is allowed to transfer the patient. No one is allowed to edit his chart. And no one is allowed to destroy any of his personal belongings until federal agents arrive. Emily felt the dog tag inside her coat pocket grow heavier. Caleb lay behind her, his breathing weak, but steadier than before. He said nothing. He only closed his eyes for one brief moment, like a man who had been running through darkness for too long and had finally heard a voice from the other side. Doctor. Vale stepped into the hallway, his voice dropping into something dangerous. This is a VA hospital. We do not take medical instructions from a switchboard operator. The young nurse shook her head. It wasn't a switchboard operator. Doctor. The call was transferred from the Federal Coordination Office. The caller identified himself as Special Agent Daniel Miller. That name made Caleb open his eyes. Emily turned back to him. It was only the smallest movement of his eyelids. But it was enough for her to know this was the man he had been trying to tell her about moments earlier. Agent Miller was not a delusion. He was not a name invented by a patient labeled paranoid. He existed, and he was coming. Dr. Vale turned toward Caleb. In his eyes, the last layer of calm finally began to crack. No one speaks to this patient until I verify the authority behind that call. Too late? A man's voice said from the end of the hallway. Everyone turned. 3 people in dark suits stepped through the emergency department doors. The man in front looked to be in his mid-40s, tall and broad-shouldered. With short-cropped hair and an open federal badge in his hand, he did not need to run. He did not need to shout. His presence alone made the hospital hallway, which had been full of internal orders and authority just seconds earlier, suddenly feel small. Special Agent Daniel Miller, FBI Healthcare Fraud Unit, the man said. As of this moment, Caleb Michael Rhodes is a protected federal witness. No one moves him from this facility without our authorization. The atmosphere changed instantly. The two hospital police officers took half a step back. The transport team looked at Dr. Vale, but no longer waited for his command. Linda lifted a hand to her mouth as if she had just seen a door she had believed was locked forever. Dr. Vale stepped forward, his voice returning to that sharp professional courtesy. Agent Miller. I am Dr. Marcus Vale, Medical Director of Hampton VA. This patient is psychiatrically unstable, presents a violence risk, and requires transfer to an appropriate facility. I'm afraid you are interfering with a medical decision. Agent Miller looked at him for 1 second, then looked past Emily toward Caleb. Dr. Vale, 4 years ago, Mr. Rhodes disappeared before he could testify in an investigation involving fraud in veteran care funds. This morning, his real name was entered back into the VA system after years of being tied to false identifiers. That triggered a federal alert. The person who entered his name was Nurse Emily Carter. So we are not interfering with medical treatment. We are preventing a federal witness from disappearing for the second time. Emily heard her name and felt her chest tighten. So that was it. Her decision to enter Caleb's real name, her refusal to let him remain John Doe, had brought the FBI here for hours. Dr. Vale had made her feel like a problem. A new nurse who did not understand her place. But the boundary he wanted her to respect had been the wall hiding a crime. Agent Miller stepped into room 412. Who is Emily Carter? Emily straightened, still standing between Caleb and the room. I am... Miller looked at her with no suspicion. No contempt. Only a quick assessment from a man used to telling fear apart from lies. You're the one who saved him. I stopped a dose of medication that could have made him stop breathing. And you have Mr. Rhoda's personal item, Dr. Vale immediately turned toward her. You are illegally holding patient property. Emily did not look at him. She reached into the inside pocket of her white coat and took out the dog tag. The faded metal rested in her palm. Small, but heavy enough to make the whole room feel weighted. He gave it to me and asked me not to give it to Dr. Vale. Agent Miller reached for it, but Emily did not hand it over immediately. Before I give this to you, Caleb needs an independent doctor, not someone under Dr. Vale, not this hospital's transport team. He went into respiratory distress. His blood type was entered incorrectly. His identity was changed. And he was nearly transferred under an order created before he was admitted. One of the agents behind Miller glanced quickly at Dr. Vale. Miller kept his eyes on Emily for another second, then nodded. Reasonable. Dr. Vale gave a humorless laugh. A new nurse is now setting conditions for the FBI inside my patient's room. Miller turned to him. No. A first medical witness is protecting the chain of evidence and the survival status of a federal witness. I would advise you to stay quiet until your attorney is present. The sentence landed like a slap without sound. For the first time that night, Dr. Vale did not answer immediately. Emily placed the dog tag into the evidence bag opened by a female agent behind Miller. Before letting go, she lightly turned the back of the trident pin toward Miller, showing him the thin metal seam Caleb had pointed out. Miller looked at it. His expression changed very little, but enough for Emily to understand that he recognized something. He said Agent Miller's name was inside. Emily said quietly. Miller looked at Caleb. Chief Rhodes. Can you hear me? Caleb opened his eyes. His lips trembled beneath the oxygen mask. Miller, I'm here, Miller said, his voice lowered, no longer sounding like an official statement. We thought you were dead. Caleb looked at him for a long time, then managed a faint shake of his head. They changed my name. I know. They used dead men. I know part of it. Miller leaned closer. But we need the rest from you. Caleb closed his eyes. As if those words had pulled him back from somewhere very far away. Emily stood beside him, watching a Navy SEAL, who had been called a nameless patient by an entire hospital, finally being addressed by his real rank by a federal agent. There was no music, no speech, only the monitor and the cold white light. But to Caleb, it may have been the first time in years that someone had confirmed he had not disappeared. Agent Miller turned to another agent. Seal the medication room, the records server, and all hallway camera footage from 130 a.m. to the present. Call the federal medical team and contact Naval Criminal Investigative Service. I want an independent military physician here within the hour. Dr. Vale immediately cut in. You cannot seal hospital systems without a court order. Miller pulled a folded document from the inside pocket of his suit jacket. Emergency order from the federal court in Norfolk. Signed 19 minutes ago. Right after Caleb Rhodes's file reappeared in the system. We have been waiting for this name for 4 years. Dr. Vale. You may want to ask yourself why. The moment it appeared, your hospital tried to move him out. The room went completely still. Linda Perez looked at the order in Miller's hand. Then at Emily. Her eyes no longer held only fear. There was pain there too. The pain of someone realizing that the things she had suspected for years had not been imagination. Maybe there had been other patients. Men who had complained. Men who had shouted their own names in hospital hallways. Men who had been marked as unstable. Men who had disappeared behind clean transfer orders. Agent Miller continued. Caleb Rhodes was part of a SEAL unit involved in an internal operation, codenamed Trident 47. During that operation, he discovered federal medical funds being pulled through fake treatment records belonging to dead or incapacitated veterans. Some of those records were connected to facilities under the network this hospital participates in. Dr. Vale answered at once. That is an unfounded accusation. Maybe, Miller said, but tonight, a federal witness was brought into your hospital as a John Doe, assigned the wrong blood type, had his chart edited, was nearly given a respiratory depressant, and had a transfer order created before admission. If that is all a coincidence, then you are having a very unlucky night. No one laughed. Even the sarcasm was too heavy to become humor. Emily looked at Caleb. His breathing had slowed, but his eyes remained open. This time, he was not watching the camera. He was not watching the door. He was not searching for an exit. He was staring up at the ceiling like a man who could finally stop standing guard for a few seconds. Miller turned to Emily. Ms. Carter, we will need your statement about everything that happened from the moment the patient arrived. I wrote it down. Emily said. Before the chart was locked, she took the small notebook from her pocket. Miller accepted it with both hands. Carefully, as if receiving something fragile. You understand that from this point on, you may become a target. Emily glanced at Dr. Vale. He stood still, but the coldness in his eyes told her the warning was not distant at all. I think I already am. Miller did not deny it. Then you need to stay close to us until your statement is complete. Dr. Vale spoke again, his voice returning to an unsettling calm. Nurse Carter has been suspended for violating procedure. Any statement she provides should be considered in the context of professional instability. Emily saw the new plan forming inside that sentence. If Dr. Vale could not move, Caleb, he would turn to her. He would turn her into the inexperienced nurse, the reckless one, the one who interfered with protocol, kept patient property, imagined codes, and created conspiracies. He no longer needed to kill the truth immediately. He only needed to make the person carrying it look unreliable. Agent Miller heard it too. He turned to Dr. Vale, his voice going cold. I am instructing you not to contact Ms. Carter. Caleb Rhodes. the medication records, camera servers, or any staff member connected to this case until we finish securing evidence. You are treating me like a suspect, Miller looked straight at him. I am trying to give you the chance not to turn yourself into one in front of your entire staff. Doctor, Vale gave a thin smile, but this time, that smile no longer controlled the room. The power had shifted. The people who once feared him were beginning to look at him differently. Not yet brave enough to stand up, but no longer completely obedient either. Emily understood the fight was not over. It had only stepped out of the darkness of the emergency room. Miller signaled for his agents to secure the hallway. The transport team was ordered out. The two hospital police officers stepped aside. Linda moved toward Caleb's bed. For the first time, without waiting for Dr. Vale's permission, she checked his oxygen line, adjusted the blanket over him, and whispered, "I'm sorry." Caleb did not answer, but his eyes softened slightly. Emily stood beside him, her throat tight. She did not know whether Linda's apology was for tonight or for all the nights before it. But she knew it had come too late for many people. And just in time, for one, Agent Miller looked toward the hallway, where federal agents were placing evidence seals across the medication storage room door. "Ms. Carter," he said, "we need you to come with us and identify where the system edits occurred." Emily nodded. Before she stepped out, she leaned down beside Caleb. "I'll come back." Caleb opened his eyes with effort. "Don't trust bright rooms." Emily understood that he was not only talking about the hospital room, he was talking about an entire system that knew how to hang words like honor beneath white lights while burying real people inside fake records. She stood and followed Agent Miller. As she passed Dr. Vale, she felt his stare cling to her back like a dark promise. And at the end of the hallway, just as the FBI began sealing the evidence, the phone inside Dr. Vale's coat pocket vibrated. He looked down at the screen, shielding it from everyone, and typed one short line. "Federal arrived. Shift to the nurse. Do you feel justice getting closer? Comment justice if you stand with Emily and Caleb." Emily had not even made it into the medication storage room with Agent Miller when her personal phone began vibrating non-stop inside the pocket of her white coat. At first, she ignored it. The emergency department hallway had been partially sealed by the FBI. Yellow evidence tape now crossed the medication room door. Hospital staff stood, gathered in distant corners, watching with a mix of curiosity and fear. Everything was happening too fast. Only minutes ago, she had been a new nurse, threatened with suspension by Dr. Vale. Now she was standing in the middle of a federal investigation, with her small shift notebook sealed inside an evidence bag, but her phone kept vibrating. Once, then again, then over and over. Agent Miller looked at her. "You should check that." Emily took out her phone. More than 20 unread messages filled the screen, along with 3 missed calls from unknown numbers. 1 call from her landlord, and a news link sent by a coworker from her unit. The headline on the screen made the blood in her body run cold. "New nurse at Hampton VA under investigation for improper interference with dangerous veteran patient." She opened the article. Her employee profile photo had been placed beside an image of an ambulance outside the hospital. The article said a probationary nurse had interfered with physician-directed care, withheld a patient's personal property, agitated a veteran showing signs of paranoia, and created a situation that forced federal authorities to intervene. There was not one word about the wrong blood type, not one word about the 204 transfer order, not one word about the medication release at 217, not one word about Caleb Rhodes. Only her. Emily reached the paragraph quoting an unnamed hospital source, and her hand tightened around the phone. The source described her as having a documented fixation on former military patients due to family circumstances, a sentence cruel enough to turn the memory of her father into evidence that she was unstable. Agent Miller noticed the change in her face. They moved faster than I expected. "It's him," Emily said, still staring at the screen. "Dr. Vale. Possibly not just him." That did not frighten Emily more. It made everything clearer. Dr. Vale was only the face standing in front of her inside the hospital room. Behind him was a system that knew how to defend itself with newspapers, disciplinary boards, personnel files, and sentences written to destroy a person's reputation without ever touching their body. Another call from her landlord appeared on the screen. Emily answered. Emily, the landlord's voice trembled. "Where are you?" "At the hospital." "What happened?" "Two people just came to your apartment. They said it was an emergency inspection for a water leak. But I never called anyone. When I got upstairs, your door was open. I called the police. But you need to come see this." Emily stood frozen in the hallway. The noise around her seemed to sink underwater. "Ms. Carter," Agent Miller asked. "My apartment was broken into." Miller immediately turned to another agent. "Send someone with her." "No." Emily looked toward room 412. "What about Caleb? He'll be moved to the military medical wing under federal protection as soon as the independent team arrives. You can't help him if they destroy you first." That sentence struck the exact fear Emily had been trying not to name. She did not want to leave Caleb, but she understood that Dr. Vale had changed the battlefield. Now that the FBI was there, he could no longer drag Caleb away in silence. So he would do the next thing. He would turn the only person who had seen the full truth into someone no one would believe. 30 minutes later, Emily stood outside her apartment in an old building not far from the hospital. The door had been forced open. The lock hung from the wooden frame like a broken joint. Local police had arrived earlier, but they were treating it as an ordinary burglary. The FBI agent accompanying Emily did not say much. He simply put on gloves and stepped inside first. Emily's small apartment had been torn apart. Drawers had been pulled from the dresser. Pillows had been sliced open. Her laptop was gone. The box holding her nursing documents had been opened. Her diploma thrown onto the floor. And the framed photo of her father in his Navy uniform had been turned face down on the kitchen table. Emily bent down and picked up the photograph. In it, Thomas Carter stood straight in front of an old American flag, his smile tired but gentle. The corner of the frame was cracked. On the kitchen table lay a stack of papers that did not belong to her. Emily stepped closer. The agent started to stop her. But she had already seen her name on the first page. Medication authorization, Caleb M. Rhodes. Below it was her electronic signature. Emily felt her stomach tighten. "I never signed this." The agent picked up the papers with gloved hands. "They left it here for you to find. So when the police or the nursing board came in, they could say, 'I hid evidence,' or that you tried to destroy it after making a mistake." Emily looked around the wrecked apartment. Nothing had been taken except her laptop and an old backup drive. This was not a robbery. It was a setup. A message. Her phone lit up again. This time, it was a video spreading online. A local account had posted a clipped piece of emergency room footage, Emily pulling the syringe away from another nurse, saying stop, then standing up to the doctor. The video cut off before Caleb stabilized. There was no oxygen crash, no glucose test, no moment when the monitor changed rhythm after her intervention. The caption read, "New nurse loses control during veteran emergency." Underneath it, hundreds of comments were already appearing. Some people called her a hero, but many others called her arrogant, attention-seeking, a nurse who had let personal emotions into a hospital emergency. Emily knew those people did not know her. They did not know Caleb either. They had only seen a piece of the truth cut so short it had become a lie. She set the phone on the table, but her hand was still shaking. The FBI agent looked at her. "Do you have somewhere safe to go?" Emily looked around her apartment. This was where she came home after 12-hour shifts. This was where she called her mother. This was where she kept her father's old coat in the closet, as a way of believing that some soldiers were still remembered. Now every open drawer looked like a wound. Even the last piece of her privacy had been turned into a battlefield. "I don't know," she said. Just then, footsteps sounded in the hallway. An elderly woman from the apartment next door appeared, holding a brown envelope against her chest. "Emily, someone left this outside your door earlier. I thought it was hospital mail." The agent took the envelope before Emily could touch it. Inside was a copy of an emergency suspension notice from Hampton VA, along with a formal notice of internal investigation for dangerous medical interference, unauthorized possession of patient property, and improper access to restricted records. On the final page, one line had been circled in red marker, "Recommendation Report to Virginia Board of Nursing." Emily stared at the line for a long time. Her nursing license, her future, her name. All of it was being dragged into the same hole Caleb had once been pushed into first. Turn the person into a problem. Then no one has to listen when they tell the truth. She turned her face away, trying to stay calm. But the tears came anyway. Not because she regretted what she had done, but because, for the first time, she understood the true cost of standing in front of a hospital bed. It did not end when you said no. That was where it began. The FBI agent lowered his voice. "Ms. Carter, we can take you somewhere safe." Emily wiped her tears with the back of her hand and looked at the photo of her father on the table. If Thomas Carter were still alive, he would not tell her not to be afraid. He knew fear was real. He would only ask her one question after you have seen what is right. "Can you still live with yourself? If you turn away..." She picked up the cracked picture frame and placed it inside the only bag that had not been torn open. "I need to go to Caleb. It isn't safe right now. He was erased for 4 years. They're trying to do the same thing to me in 4 hours." Emily looked at the agent, her voice rough but clear. "If I disappear from this story, they'll say he was paranoid. I was unstable. And everything else was just a system error." The agent stopped arguing. He called Agent Miller. When Emily returned to the hospital under FBI escort, the sky outside had begun to pale. Dawn had not fully arrived. But the darkness was no longer absolute. Hampton VA stood ahead of her. Clean, brightly lit, with the American flag flying above it, as if no one inside had ever been pushed to the edge of life and death. At the employee entrance, a group of reporters had gathered. Someone had tipped them off. The moment they saw Emily step out of the FBI vehicle, camera lights swung toward her. "Ms. Carter, do you admit you interfered with medical protocol? Did you keep the patient's dog tag? Is it true your father was diagnosed with a war-related psychiatric disorder?" The last question made Emily stop. Not because it weakened her, but because it proved Dr. Vale, or someone behind him, had dug far enough into her life to turn her family's pain into a weapon. She turned toward the reporters, the lights reflecting off her exhausted face. But there was no confusion left in her eyes. "I will answer every question when Caleb Rhodes is safe enough to speak under his real name," she said. Then she walked past them. Inside the hallway, Agent Miller was waiting. His face was more serious than before. "We just discovered the medication room camera server was accessed remotely 12 minutes after we sealed it. Someone tried to delete the footage." Emily tightened her grip on her bag. "What about Caleb? He's being moved to the military medical wing." "But Dr. Vale has filed a report claiming you fabricated your notes and agitated the patient with an imaginary code." Emily let out a very small laugh. Not because it was funny, but because the cruelty was so perfectly aligned with how the system worked. "So they're going to say I'm crazy like him." "Possibly." "And do you believe me?" Miller looked at her. "I believe evidence. And I believe the fact that they're trying to destroy you this quickly means you hit the right nerve." Emily looked toward the end of the hallway, where room 412 was now sealed. Her apartment had been torn apart. Her reputation had been smeared. Her nursing license was under threat. But inside her bag, the cracked photograph of her father was still there. Heavy and real. And somewhere, in a federally protected medical room, Caleb Rhodes was still alive. That was everything they had not managed to take. Emily drew in a deep breath. Then we find the part of the evidence they didn't erase in time. Miller nodded. Auxiliary server room. She followed him through the cold white hallway of Hampton, VA. Behind her, the voices of reporters still carried through the glass doors. Ahead of her, the hospital lights stretched into a hard, emotionless line. Emily knew she had just lost the last of her safety. But the light in her eyes had not gone out. From this moment on, this was no longer only about saving one patient. It was a fight to prove that a system could lie through paperwork. But it could not erase every trace as long as one person was stubborn enough to follow the truth all the way to the end. The auxiliary server room was located in the eastern basement of Hampton, VA. Behind 2 layers of steel doors and a narrow hallway, thick with the warm dust smell of electrical equipment. Emily walked beside Agent Miller, listening to their shoes strike sharply against the concrete floor. Behind her were the broken apartment, the edited video, and the reporter's questions sharpened into weapons against the memory of her father. In front of her was a door with no slogan, no veteran photographs, no American flag. Only a small sign that read, "Authorized personnel only." Agent Miller scanned his federal badge. Then, an FBI digital forensics specialist entered the emergency seal code. The door opened, revealing rows of black server racks taller than a person. Their green and red lights blinking inside the constant hum of cooling fans. Emily stood before the room and suddenly understood if the emergency room was where Caleb had nearly lost his life. This was where his identity had nearly been killed. "What are we looking for?" she asked. Miller looked at the data specialist. "Pre-edit backups, medication room footage, access logs from 204 and 217. Anything connected to Caleb Rhodes. John Doe, Trident, Quattro Set, and the MVale admin account." The specialist sat at the console. Lines of code moved across the screen. Emily did not understand all the technical details, but she understood medical timing. She knew a real patient case had an order to it: intake, assessment, diagnosis, orders, intervention. Caleb's chart had gone backward. The transfer order came before the patient. The diagnosis came before the evaluation. The medication came before the reason for giving it. That was not chaos. That was a false story written in advance, waiting for Caleb's body to appear so it could be forced inside it. "There's an auxiliary server backup," the specialist said after a few minutes. "Someone tried to wipe the main camera footage, but the system caches internally every 15 minutes. They didn't get this part in time." Miller leaned toward the screen. Emily stepped closer too. The video appeared. The image was slightly grainy, with no audio, but it was clear enough. At 2:13 a.m. Caleb lay on a gurney in the emergency room. At 2:06, a nurse prepared the syringe. At 2:07, Emily stepped forward and blocked it. And in the corner of the frame, Dr. Vale appeared before anyone had officially called him in. He stood outside the door for a few seconds, looking in, then lowered his head toward his phone. The next clip came from the medication room camera. Dr. Vale used an administrator badge to open the controlled substance cabinet, removed a small vial, placed it on a tray, and left. It was no longer suspicion, no longer notes from a new nurse. The cold image on the screen was saying what Caleb had not been strong enough to say. Emily felt her chest tighten. "He was there before I stopped the injection." Miller nodded. "And he lied about only being called in afterward." The specialist opened the chart logs next. Edits appeared in chronological order. Caleb Rhodes changed to John Doe. Military service history locked. Delusional diagnosis added. Transfer order created. Blood type modified. Medication reaction warning deleted. Everything revolved around one purpose: to turn Caleb into someone who could no longer prove who he was. But the part that silenced the room was not Caleb's chart. It was the list found inside the memory card hidden behind the trident pin. When the specialist decrypted the first layer of protection, dozens of names appeared on the screen. Beside each name were service numbers, dates of service, medical status, and recurring treatment payments. Emily scanned the lines and saw several marked deceased. Yet the payment columns continued for months, even years. After the listed death dates, some names had notes attached. Behavioral instability, incompetent for testimony, transferred external, no family contact. Agent Miller stood perfectly still. This is what he kept alive for 4 years. Emily looked at the first name marked in red, Aaron Whitaker, USN, KIA, Kandahar. Beside it was a rehabilitation payment file in Virginia, continuing for 8 years after the man had died in combat. Caleb's teammate, Emily said softly. Miller nodded. And not just one. The server room door opened. A woman in a gray suit stepped inside, her hair tied back neatly, a federal briefcase in her hand. Miller turned. Prosecutor Monroe. Rachel Monroe did not shake anyone's hand right away. She looked at the screen, read several lines, and her face hardened with the look of someone who had seen enough to understand this was no longer a cover-up inside one hospital. How many records, she asked. The specialist answered. The memory card contains 47 names, but the payment patterns connect to at least 12 affiliated medical facilities, possibly more. Monroe turned to Emily. Ms. Carter, I need you to explain this in medical terms. Could these edits be justified as procedure? Emily stepped toward the screen and pointed to each timestamp. Her voice was rough at first, but steadied as she spoke. No, this is not a normal documentation error. The transfer order was created before the patient arrived. The psychiatric diagnosis was entered before evaluation. His blood type was changed to data that did not match his dog tag. Sedation was prepared, even though his vital signs showed respiratory distress. If I had not stopped the injection, Caleb could have died. And the chart would have said he died from agitation, exhaustion, or complications from non-compliance. Monroe looked at her. Are you willing to say that in court? Emily was silent for 1 second. She thought about the article that had called her an out-of-control nurse. She thought about her apartment being torn apart. She thought about the nursing license that could be taken from her. Then she thought about Caleb lying behind the door of room 412. His bruised hand, still trying to tap Morse code, so he would not disappear. Yes, she said, but Caleb has to be protected first. He is being transported to a military medical facility under federal supervision. Miller said, NCIS is involved now. We are also seeking a protective order for you. Rachel Monroe placed her briefcase on the table. Protecting her is necessary, but it is not enough. Dr. Vale has already started attacking Ms. Carter's credibility. If we rely only on her testimony, the other side will turn the hearing into a trial of her character. We need another inside witness. The room fell silent. Emily immediately thought of Linda Perez, as if he had read her mind. Miller asked, The night shift charge nurse. Emily nodded. Linda saw the transfer order. She knows it was created before admission, but she's scared. Monroe replied, Fear is understandable. The question is whether she still has a conscience. They found Linda in the staff break room behind the emergency department. She was sitting alone at a small table, both hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold. When Emily walked in with the FBI and the federal prosecutor, Linda did not look surprised. She only looked at Emily for a long time, as if she had been waiting for this moment for years and still wished it had never come. "I don't know as much as you think I do," Linda said first. Emily sat across from her. "You know enough." Linda gave a faint, exhausted laugh. "Knowing enough is how people lose their jobs here." Rachel Monroe pulled out a chair and sat beside them, her voice clear but not forceful. "Ms. Perez, we have evidence from the auxiliary server. Dr. Vale will not be able to bury all of this. The question is, when the truth comes out, do you want to be remembered as someone who helped save a patient? Or someone who stood by and watched Linda lowered her head? The coffee cup trembled slightly in her hands. "You don't understand. In 2019, a nurse named Mark Benson reported fake treatment billing. They said he was addicted to painkillers. He lost his license. 6 months later, he took his own life. In 2021, a rehabilitation doctor asked why a patient who had already died still had therapy appointments. She was forced out for occupational stress disorder. I have a daughter in college. I have a mortgage. I stayed quiet because I was a coward." "All right." Emily did not answer immediately. She looked at the woman in front of her and, for the first time, saw more than a frightened charge nurse. She saw someone who had been trained by the system to believe that survival meant lowering her head. "You weren't a coward because you were afraid," Emily said. "But Caleb will die if all of us keep being afraid at the exact moment they need us silent." Linda closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were wet. "I have copies." Miller immediately looked up. "Copies of what?" "After-hours transfers." "Not all of them. Just a few files. I started saving them after Mark Benson." Linda reached into her pocket and took out a small key. "In my locker. Blue USB drive." No one spoke for several seconds. Sometimes the truth does not arrive like an explosion. Sometimes it arrives as a tiny object in the trembling hand of someone who has finally decided not to bow anymore. Linda's USB drive contained 16 other transfer records, all following the same pattern. Veteran patients who asked questions about benefits or treatment records, then were labeled behaviorally unstable, transferred out, and disappeared from the official tracking system. 3 of them died within a month of transfer. 2 had no contact address. 1 had filed a complaint with the same office Caleb had been scheduled to testify before. Rachel Monroe looked at the list, her voice dropping lower. "This is no longer about hiding one witness. This is a pattern." Emily felt sick. A pattern. Such a dry word for dozens of human beings turned into data lines. Erased through diagnoses, silenced with medication, and billed even after death. Miller turned to the specialist. "Back up everything. Send encrypted copies to the federal office in Norfolk. I want emergency warrants and asset freeze orders for the affiliated companies before noon." Monroe looked at Emily. "Ms. Carter, Caleb Rhodes and Linda Perez will have to testify. You will be attacked even harder. They will say you are obsessed because of your father. They will say Caleb is delusional. They will say Linda is a disgruntled employee. But now we have data, camera footage, system logs, transfer orders, financial records, and an internal witness." Emily looked through the break room window. Morning light had begun to fill the hospital hallway. Day shift staff were starting to arrive, unaware that beneath the clean tile floors they were walking across, a truth had been rotting for years. When she asked, Monroe closed the file. "Emergency hearing in federal court in Norfolk. As soon as possible." At that moment, Miller's phone rang. He answered, said only a few words, and his face turned serious. Caleb woke up in the military transport. Miller said after hanging up, "He is requesting to give a statement immediately." He says there is a hidden folder on the memory card containing the final recipient. Who is it? Emily asked. Miller looked at her. Then, at Monroe. We haven't opened it yet. But Caleb says if that folder is decrypted, Dr. Vale will only be the first one to fall. Emily stood still. She had known there were people behind Dr. Day. Vale. But hearing it confirmed made the room feel darker. This fight was bigger than one hospital. Bigger than one night shift. Bigger even than her fear of losing her job. But it had still begun with the smallest thing. A nurse refusing to let a man be sedated again when he was fighting to breathe. Miller put his phone away. We're going to Norfolk. Emily looked at her small notebook inside the evidence bag. Then at Linda, who was wiping tears away with the back of her hand. After years of silence, one person had chosen to speak. After 4 years of being erased, Caleb Rhodes had returned as a witness. And after one night of being turned into a troublemaker, Emily understood that honor was not something the system gave her. It was something she had to protect with every choice she made. She stood, then let's bring the truth into the light. Share this story if you believe buried records still need someone willing to dig them up. And erased. People still deserve to be called by their real names. The federal vehicle left Hampton, VA, just as the sun rose above the dew-covered rooftops. And Emily sat silently in the back seat, both hands resting on her knees. Her eyes looked through the window, but her mind remained in the emergency room where everything had begun, with a syringe that had almost been pushed into an IV line. Norfolk was not far, but the road to the federal courthouse that morning felt as long as a lifetime. Beside her, Linda Perez held tightly to the bag containing the blue USB drive, her face pale, but no longer looking away. Up front, Agent Miller spoke briefly on the phone with Prosecutor Monroe. No one offered any grand words of encouragement. They all understood that encouragement could not lower the cost of the truth. When the vehicle stopped in front of the federal courthouse in Norfolk, reporters were already waiting at the foot of the stone steps. Camera lights flashed. Voices calling Emily's name mixed with the cold wind blowing in from the Elizabeth River. Some asked if she had falsified records. Some asked whether Caleb Rhodes had really been a Navy SEAL. One person shouted a question about her father, as if the pain of a dead Navy corpsman could be used to prove his daughter was not mentally sound. Emily stopped for half a second. Then she kept walking. Linda stayed close beside her, her hand trembling but never letting go of the bag. Inside the hearing room, Caleb Rhodes was already there. He sat in a wheelchair behind the witness table, wearing a white dress shirt and a dark jacket prepared by the Federal Protection Team. His face was still hollow, and bruises still showed beneath the cuffs at his wrists. But his dog tag had been returned to his chest after the FBI sealed it, examined it, and documented the chain of evidence. When Emily entered, Caleb looked up. No words were needed. One glance was enough for her to understand the man who had once been called John Doe, who had once been restrained to a hospital bed and nearly transferred away in the dark, was now sitting in public light under his real name. Dr. Marcus Vale sat on the opposite side with his attorney. He still wore a tailored suit. His hair was neatly combed. His face held the same composure he had worn in hospital board meetings. But today, that calm no longer made the room quiet with respect. It only made him look like a man trying to keep his mask in place before the cracks reached his eyes. Prosecutor Rachel Monroe stood first. She did not begin with dramatic accusations. She opened a screen and displayed the timeline from that night. 204 transfer order created. 211 patient admitted. 217 medication released under MVale admin. 218 chart changed back to John Doe. 221 Nurse Emily Carter stopped the sedative injection. The numbers appeared on the screen, cold and emotionless. But it was precisely that coldness that made the courtroom feel heavy. A lie could be decorated with medical terminology. Time could not. Dr. Vale's attorney immediately objected, arguing that system data needed verification, that emergency settings sometimes required preparatory actions, and that Emily Carter was a suspended employee with a motive to protect herself. Monroe simply nodded, then played the footage from the auxiliary server. On the screen, everyone saw Doctor speak. Vale enter the medication room at 217. Use his administrator badge to open the cabinet. Remove a small vial and place it on a tray. Minutes later, in the emergency room, Emily appeared in the frame, blocking the injection as Caleb's oxygen began to fall. There was no narration, no music. The raw truth was more powerful than any speech. Emily was called to testify next. She walked to the witness chair, took the oath, and felt dozens of eyes settle on her. Below, Dr. Vale watched her with familiar coldness, as if reminding her that he could still destroy her. But this time, Emily was not standing in room 412. She was not alone. Monroe asked her about the first 5 minutes in the emergency room. Emily answered slowly and clearly. Caleb's gray-purple lips, his falling oxygen, his sluggish pupils, the hand that had not been attacking anyone, only trying to push away the IV line, the blood type on his dog tag that did not match the hospital wristband, the sedative dose that could have suppressed his breathing. She did not try to turn herself into a hero. She only said what she had seen, what she had done, and what a responsible nurse could not ignore. Then Dr. Vale's attorney stood for cross-examination. He asked about her experience level, her probationary status, her father, a former Navy corpsman who had been diagnosed with a post-war disorder. He asked whether she might have projected her personal pain onto an unfamiliar patient. That question made the courtroom go still. Emily looked down at her hands. She remembered the cracked picture frame on her kitchen table. She remembered her father's voice teaching her to hear the silence between Morse taps. Then she raised her head. My father was misunderstood, she said. That does not make me less objective. It makes me more careful before calling a soldier's fear insanity. But if the court does not want to trust my memory, then please trust the camera footage, the medication logs, the glucose result, and the timestamp showing that the transfer order was created before the patient was admitted. No one in the room spoke for several seconds after that. Linda Perez testified next. She stepped forward with a bloodless face. But once she began speaking, her voice was steadier than Emily expected. Linda described the after-hours transfers, the charts relabeled as behavioral instability, and the employees who had asked questions and then lost their jobs. She named Mark Benson, the nurse who had once reported fraudulent billing and had his reputation destroyed afterward. When the blue USB drive was entered into evidence, Dr. Vale's shoulders stiffened slightly. For the first time, he did not look at Linda as an employee under his authority. He looked at her like a door he had forgotten to lock. Then Caleb Rhodes was brought forward. The courtroom fell silent as he placed one hand over the dog tag on his chest. His voice was weak, each word passing through a body not yet healed. But no one mistook that weakness for confusion. He stated his name, his rank, his unit. He spoke about Trident 4-7. He spoke about discovering that his teammate, Aaron Whitaker, who had died in Kandahar, was still being used to bill for rehabilitation treatment in Virginia. He spoke about veterans turned into payment records, about men who asked questions and were then labeled delusional, incompetent, or without family contact. When the opposing attorney asked whether he was certain those memories were not the product of wartime trauma, Caleb stayed silent for a long time. I forget many things, he finally said. I forget the smell of the room they kept me in. I forget how many days they held me under a false name. I forget how many times I woke up with restraints on my wrists. But I do not forget the name of my dead teammate. And I do not forget the man who tried to inject me when I could not breathe, under the supervision of the digital forensics specialist. Monroe opened the hidden folder from the Trident memory card in court. Everyone expected to see another list of patients. But the screen showed money transfers through shell companies. Approval, signatures, facility codes, and finally the names of those receiving the benefits. Doctor. Marcus Vale stood at a key link in the chain. But he was not the only link. Above him was a private management fund holding veteran care contracts. Below him were transfer facilities used to make inconvenient people disappear. Monroe turned to the judge. Your Honor, this was not an administrative error. This was a pattern of profit carried out under the name of caring for those who serve this country. And when a living witness returned, the defendant attempted to turn him into an unidentified, incapacitated patient and move him away before federal authorities could verify him. Doctor. Vale's attorney stood to object, but his voice had lost its certainty. Doctor. Vale sat motionless. His face had grown paler. His lips pressed tight. The man who had once told Emily that compassion was not allowed to replace discipline was now having his own power stripped away. Layer by layer. By legal discipline. The judge called a 10-minute recess to review the emergency arrest request and asset freeze orders. During the short break, Emily sat beside Caleb. He did not look at her right away. He looked down at the dog tag in his hand, his thumb moving across the scratched line of his name. You called me by the right name, he said quietly. Emily looked at him. You kept your name alive for 4 years. I only read it out loud. Caleb closed his eyes. A small tear slid down his hollow cheek. It was not collapse. It was the relief of a man finally allowed to be tired. When the hearing resumed, the judge read the decision in a firm voice. Dr. Marcus Vale was arrested on the spot for obstruction of a federal investigation, conspiracy to harm a witness, falsification of medical records, and involvement in federal healthcare fraud. At the same time, the court ordered the freezing of accounts belonging to the affiliated companies and expanded the investigation to the full network of medical facilities named in the memory card. 2 federal agents stepped behind Dr. Vale. In the final seconds before he was handcuffed, he looked toward Emily. This time, there was no cold contempt left in his eyes. Only the naked rage of a man who could not believe that a new nurse, someone he had once thought could be ordered out of a room with a single command, had stood still long enough to drag his entire system into the light. No one clapped when he was led away. The room did not need cheering. The moment was heavier than celebration. Linda bowed her head and cried silently. Agent Miller stood straight. His eyes on the files spread across the table. Caleb placed a hand over his dog tag. Emily simply sat still, feeling her whole body go weak, as if every fear from the night before had finally found a way out. Outside the courthouse, the reporters rushed toward them again. But this time, the questions had changed. They were no longer asking whether Emily had lost control. They were asking how she had uncovered the misconduct, who Caleb Rhodes was, and how many other veterans had been erased inside that system. Emily stopped on the stone steps, the noon light falling across her exhausted face. She did not give a long answer. She only looked toward Caleb, who was being pushed behind her by federal agents, and said, I didn't uncover a conspiracy because I wanted to be a hero. I looked at a patient and refused to let anyone call him by the wrong name. The wind moved through the flags in front of the courthouse. In that moment, the truth was no longer locked inside a dog tag, an auxiliary server, or a small notebook hidden in the pocket of a white coat. It stood in broad daylight, before the court, before the cameras, before the people who had once believed that a large system always knew what it was doing. And for the first time in 4 years, Caleb Rhodes left the courthouse not as a delusional patient, not as John Doe, not as a risk to be managed. He left under his real name. Caleb Rhodes left the courthouse under his real name. But healing did not come that same day. It came slowly. Over the long weeks after the hearing, as Hampton VA Medical Center replaced its entire leadership team, as federal agents carried box after box of records out of storage rooms, and as the families of veterans who had once been denied answers began receiving their first calls from the prosecutor's office, it came in the heavy silence of people who had signed transfer papers without reading them closely. It came in the lowered eyes of doctors who had once called patients risks. It came in the evening news, when the name Caleb Michael Rhodes was no longer spoken as the name of a delusional patient, but as the witness who had survived long enough to drag a criminal network into the light. Emily returned to the hospital 3 months later. Not through the side entrance used by suspended employees, but through the main entrance, where the American flag still hung high and the words, "Serving those who served," remained on the white wall. This time, the slogan no longer made her chest tighten like a shameless lie. It was still heavy. It was still stained by things that could not be fully repaired. But at least now, beneath those words, someone had been forced to pay for betraying the very promise they carried. Linda Perez was waiting for her in the lobby. She no longer wore the exhausted toughness of someone simply trying to survive another shift. On her chest was a new badge. Beneath her name was an added title, Patient Safety Review Board. When she saw Emily, Linda walked over and hugged her tightly. Neither of them spoke for the first few seconds. Some apologies, when spoken too soon, become smaller than the pain they are trying to reach. "I thought I was too late," Linda said quietly. Emily looked at her. "You spoke when Caleb needed you." Linda shook her head, her eyes turning red. "No, I spoke when I couldn't stay silent anymore." The two of them walked through the emergency department hallway. Room 412 had been converted into an independent observation room. Camera footage was now stored through a federal system. Every high-risk patient transfer required approval from 2 physicians from separate departments. On the same door where the curtain had once been drawn shut, a small sign now read, "No patient may be transferred without documented review and identity verification." Emily stopped in front of the door for a moment. She still remembered Caleb lying inside, his wrists bruised, his eyes fixed on the camera, tapping Morse code with the last of his strength. "He wants to see you," Linda said. Caleb was no longer at Hampton VA. He had been transferred to a veterans rehabilitation center outside Virginia, where the windows of his room looked out over oak trees and a small lawn where an American flag was raised every morning. When Emily arrived, he was sitting on the porch. His wheelchair stood beside the chair, but it was no longer something holding him in place. He was thinner than before, his hair neatly cut, his face still marked by exhaustion, but his eyes no longer scanned the ceiling, the doors, and the cameras like a man being hunted. On his chest, the dog tag had been cleaned, but the scratches remained. Emily sat in the chair beside him. For a long while, they only looked out at the lawn. The wind moved through the trees in a soft, steady sound. Nothing like the beeping monitors in the emergency room that night. "How many more did they find?" Caleb asked. Emily knew he was not asking about the money. He was asking about the names. 19 families have been notified, she said. 7 cases are being reopened. 3 living veterans were removed from affiliated facilities. Prosecutor Monroe said the number may keep growing. Caleb closed his eyes. There was no full relief on his face. Survivors do not usually celebrate being right, because being right often comes with a list of people who did not live long enough to be believed. "What about Aaron?" he asked. Emily took a small envelope from her coat pocket. Inside was a copy of the posthumous honor decision for Aaron Whitaker, Caleb's teammate who had died in Kandahar but whose name had been used for 8 years of fraudulent billing. Aaron's family had received an official apology, and all the money stolen through his file had been redirected into a scholarship fund for the children of fallen veterans. Caleb held the paper with both hands. The fingers that once trembled from medication still trembled. But this time for a different reason. He bowed his head for a long time. When he finally looked up, His eyes were red and his voice was rough. He finally gets to rest. Emily did not answer. She simply sat beside him, guarding the silence that was needed after too many years of fake records drowning out the truth. A few weeks later, Emily was invited to Washington, D.C., for the announcement of a new veteran care oversight reform program. She was not used to podiums, cameras, or being called a brave whistleblower. She still thought of herself as a nurse who had seen a patient unable to breathe and done what anyone should have done. But as she stood before the room, looking at the veterans seated in the front row, at Caleb in a dark suit, at Linda behind him, and at Agent Miller standing beside Prosecutor Monroe, she understood that sometimes one right action does not end with a single life being saved. Sometimes it becomes a door for many others to walk out of the dark. The proposed law was called the Rhodes-Carter Veteran Patient Protection Act. It required hospitals receiving veteran care funding to independently verify patient identities before declaring them incapacitated, store sensitive medical camera footage on servers that could not be altered internally, protect whistleblowing staff from retaliatory suspension, and require federal review for every after-hours emergency psychiatric transfer. When the host invited Emily to speak, she stood and held the paper she had prepared. But when she looked down at the words, she did not read them. She folded the paper. That night, she said, "I did not see a federal case. I did not see a law. I saw a man being called by the wrong name while he was trying to breathe. And I believe the first responsibility of any system built to care for people is not to control them, but to look at them long enough to understand what they truly need." The room was silent. Emily continued, her voice not loud, but steady. "Some soldiers come home with wounds that do not show up on a scan. Some patients are difficult to understand, difficult to believe, difficult to care for, but that does not give us the right to turn them into risks to be managed. Caleb Rhodes survived because he never let go of his name. I was only the person who read it out loud. But if a new nurse could do that in 5 minutes, then a large system has no excuse for needing years to learn it." There was no immediate cheering, only a deep silence. Then the applause began in the front rows, where the veterans were seated. Caleb did not clap loudly. He simply placed a hand over the dog tag on his chest and looked at Emily with the eyes of a man who had finally been given back a kind of honor no medical record could measure. After the ceremony, Emily did not go to the reception. She drove to a small veterans memorial in Virginia, where her father's name was carved into a stone dedicated to Navy corpsmen who had served in the Iraq War. Evening came slowly. Soft golden light spreading across the stone. She placed a white flower in front of the name Thomas Carter, along with her old nursing badge. The same badge she had removed in room 412 when Dr. Vale threatened to end her career. "I didn't lose it," she whispered, as if her father were still sitting across the kitchen table, tapping Morse code into the wood. "I just had to remember why I wore it." Behind her, Caleb arrived in his wheelchair, pushed by Agent Miller. Linda was there too, holding a small bouquet for Mark Benson. The nurse, who had not lived long enough to see the truth, recognized. None of them said much. Some battles do not end with cheers. They end when the living can finally stand still before the names of the dead without feeling they have betrayed them. Caleb placed a folded paper at the base of the memorial. On it was the list of names, restored from the false records. Aaron Whitaker was first. "No one is John Doe anymore," he said. Emily looked at the words carved into the stone, then at the American flag, moving gently in the evening wind. Justice had come late. Late for Aaron. Late for Mark Benson. Late for the families who had spent years believing they did not deserve the truth. But it had come because one soldier never let go of his dog tag. Because one charge nurse finally opened an old locker. Because one agent never abandoned a missing person file. And because one new nurse stood in front of the wrong injection and said no. Months later, Emily accepted a position coordinating the Veteran Patient Protection Unit at Hampton VA. On the wall, across from the nurses' station, where only polished slogans had once hung, there was now a simple line written in black metal: "Listen before you label." Every time Emily passed it, she stopped for 1 second, not out of pride, but to remember that toxic systems often begin the moment human beings are turned into labels. Dangerous, delusional, homeless, unreliable. And justice sometimes begins with the smallest act of all, calling someone by their rightful name. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If Emily and Caleb's journey reminded you that courage still matters, hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story of justice.